Morning. In this video, I'm going to cover some advanced focusing techniques. Now this is a follow-up to my previous video on beginner's guide to focusing techniques, and if you didn't see that, check it out up here or down below in the comments. Hope you find this video useful. I'm going to start with a little bit of theory. You may have heard of a lens being described as a fast lens. Now the reason for this is because the lens has a fast autofocus speed, and this is because the lens opens up the aperture to the widest possible to do the focusing, so the most amount of light comes into the camera. Then when you take the shot, the camera closes the lens down to the aperture that you've set to take the picture. This is why when you look through the viewfinder, you get a perfectly bright picture, even if you've got a very small aperture. Most DSLRs use what's called a phase detection focusing system, whereas most point and shoots, mirrorless cameras and mobile phones use what's called a contrast detection focus system. Now the two systems are quite different, but the bottom line is that an SLR can struggle in some occasions. In an SLR, a tiny bit of light is sent down to sensors that are capable of figuring out whether the image is in focus. The science behind this involves splitting the two beams of incoming light and then comparing them to see if they match up. If they don't match up, then a message is sent to the focusing motor that aligns the focus so that the beams do match up. Normal focusing points can struggle on focusing on vertical lines. A contrast detect focusing system can be a little bit slower but doesn't have this problem. This is why SLRs have another kind of focusing point. It's called a cross-focusing point, and it allows for faster autofocus and doesn't have the problem with vertical lines. Not all cameras have the same amount of cross-focusing points. For example, the Nikon D750 has 15 cross-focusing points, whereas the Nikon D850 has 99 cross-focusing points. Now certain lenses can reduce the amount of cross-focusing points that are active. So it's worth checking out your manual to find out which of your focus points are cross-focusing points, because these give a faster and more accurate autofocus. Generally speaking though, the center focus point is usually a cross-focus point. So that's it for the theory. Now when you start to take shots, what you have to decide is which autofocus mode is the correct one for you. The first thing to decide is which autofocus mode that you're going to use. Now if you're shooting a stationary subject on a Nikon, choose the AFS mode. On a Canon, that's the one-shot focus. This has the advantage that when you press the shutter halfway, you can then recompose without the camera trying to lock onto a new target. On a Nikon, this is a simple process of pressing the autofocus button and then rotating the back dial to toggle between the different autofocus modes. For other cameras, check your manual. Then choose the area autofocus mode, for which there are quite a few. Now for a stationary subject, choose the top one, which is a single focus point. This can be achieved by pressing the autofocus button and rotating the front dial. A single focus point can be moved around in this shot. This can help you with composition, especially if your subject is off-center. The advantage of a single focus point is it allows the photographer complete control over which point the camera focuses on. If your subject is likely to move, then you should choose the AFC, or in Canon, the AI servo mode. This allows the camera to track the subject as it moves and make sure it stays in focus. There are many options for autofocus modes that assist with moving subjects. You'll note several dynamic modes all have different amount of focus points. Now the small one, perhaps with 9, would be useful if you want to make sure that you're keeping your focus tight, but then they expand out to track more and more of the frame as the subject moves. 3D tracking is similar, but it has the advantage of being able to detect colours. So if you were taking a picture of a white bird amongst a group of black birds, then it would be able to lock onto that one bird and pick it out and stay focused. Group mode uses a series of 5 points that are always active. The camera will look at those 5 points and see which part of the subject is closest and use that autofocus point to select where it focuses. The final autofocus mode is complete auto, and I must be honest that I've never used this. I like to have a little bit more control over where the camera focuses, and this puts all the decision in the hands of the camera. I put a link in the description below to an article that gives a really good detailed description of all the autofocus modes. Next, you need to decide how you're going to engage the autofocus. The most common way is to hold the shutter button halfway down to engage autofocus, and I did cover this in a previous video that I'll link here. When in single focus mode, you can use the center focus point, which is a cross type, hold the shutter button halfway down and then recompose. Some people like to use the AEAF lock button. This allows you to use the AF continuous mode, but then once you gain the focus lock, by pressing this button, it stops the camera from reacquiring a focus lock when you recompose. The method that I currently use is called back button focusing. Now, it takes some getting used to, and some people prefer the method that I've described above. It involves focusing using the button on the back of the camera and not the shutter button. Once you've got a focus lock, you can either take your finger off the button and then the camera will maintain its focus and you can press the shutter as many times as you want. Or if you're in continuous mode, keep the finger on the button and then it will track subjects without you having to hover over the shutter button. This has several advantages. There are less accidental shutter activations, the camera doesn't waste time focusing every time you press the shutter button, and for me it just feels more intuitive. The Nikon D850 has a dedicated AF on button, but if your camera doesn't have one of these, then you can assign another button. To do this, you go into the autofocus menu and select the AF activation and then turn the shutter off so it's AF on only. Then you need to go down to the controls menu and assign the control button. So the AF button here, you can then assign to the AF on. Your camera's menu structure might be different than mine, so if you're not sure how to engage this function, go and check the manual. It's worth giving back button focusing a try. I couldn't go back to half pressing the shutter button now, and believe me, I have tried. I rarely use live focusing mode because it's a big drain on the battery. However, it can be useful when assisting with manual focusing, particularly with things like macro photography. Often a camera will not autofocus on a close object. This lens can focus on an object 31 centimeters away, but will not autofocus at that distance. In these situations, manual focus is the only option. The best technique is to zoom in on the live view on the back of the camera, then rotate the focus ring until the subject comes into focus. When the subject is in focus, then you can press the shutter button and take the shot. I have also used this technique for some landscapes and astrophotography. I have covered depth of field in a previous video linked here, but in those videos I did focus more on minimizing depth of field and blurring backgrounds when taking pictures of birds. Taking pictures of landscapes that require more depth of field use slightly different techniques. The main principles really are using a shorter focal length and a smaller aperture. A word of warning here though, it's very tempting to think that if you use a smaller aperture, something like an f/22, that you'll get even more depth of field. However, what happens is once you go past something like f/16, you start to lose detail because of what's called diffraction. All lenses have an aperture where they're at their sharpest, usually around f8 to f11, and the rule of thumb is it's about 3 stops less than the maximum aperture of the lens. The best way though is to experiment with your own lenses. Try out some test shots and I think you'll be surprised by the difference it makes from going from a wide aperture to say an f8 or an f11 about how much sharper the images are. To demonstrate this, I've used my depth of field app to compare 2 different focal lengths. With a subject 4 meters away and an aperture of f11, with a 50mm lens, there is a depth of field of 6 meters. Compare this to a 20mm lens, which has an infinite depth of field, so everything that is further than 91 centimeters away from the camera should be acceptably sharp. These settings would be great for a landscape. If you do want to use a longer focal length, a good way to maximise depth of field is to focus on the most distant object. With this example, the subject is 4 miles away, and then this gives an infinite depth of field with everything that is further than 7.5 meters away acceptably sharp. If the focus point is just a mile away, then the depth of field is virtually identical. Finally, there are some times when physics is always going to win, and it will be impossible to get a shot that's in focus from front to back. So in this situation, you can employ something called focus stacking. This can be useful in a landscape if the foreground is very close to the camera and it needs to be in focus. Also, it can be very useful in macro photography. In this shot, the fossil is perfectly sharp at the front, but because of the shallow depth of field, the back is completely blurred. What you need to do is take a series of shots with every area sharp in at least one shot. This can be achieved by setting the focus to manual and then focus on the nearest part and take the shot. Then turn the focus ring to focus on an area of the object that is a little further away from the camera, and repeat this until you have all areas of the object with a shot with some part in focus. What I normally do to help me identify the shots when I look at them on the computer is take a picture of one finger at the beginning of the series of shots and 2 fingers at the end of the shot. With a landscape, 3 images should suffice to get everything sharp from front to back. But with a macro shot, you may need to take up to 20 or 30 images to stack together to get everything perfectly sharp. Once you have your series of images, you can then use some imaging software such as Photoshop to stack them together. I've put a link below to a video that goes over all the details about how to stack them together. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, don't forget to like and subscribe. My next video is going to be part of my beginner series, which is going to cover how to get the correct exposure using shutter speed, aperture and ISO. But for now, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.